Hey guys, there, Dr. Scott here. We got some great health information. I got my great friend, Dr. Mike Dody from Colorado here. He, again, is just a genius on research and presentation, and he's has a great clinic down in Denver and Austin family. And I really appreciate his outlook and us like talking back and forth about health issues and what's going on with coronavirus. As you guys remember, last spring we did a video on deaths and like what's going on and all these different things that were happening. And you guys got a chance to check that out. And so now here we are almost 4 months later into the coronavirus. And as we're tracking things, what we talked about then is really coming up to be kind of apparent right now. So we have all this more data as we move forward. And today we want to talk about, was the lockdown really worth it? And Mike's really dug deep into some great laws and different theories and books that show what's really going on.
Yeah.
So take it away, Mike. What do you got to say?
Well, I appreciate having me back again. I know that we talked a lot about the statistics last time, and whether this was going to be as bad as everybody was panicking it was going to be, and we're still kind of in that state of fear. But I really wanted to look at the lockdown, and the only way I could feel that would work the best was to compare a country who didn't do a lockdown versus our country who did, and so I wanted to see what were those numbers. But before we dive into that, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go a little bit into some epidemiology. I don't want to lose anybody, but I just want people to understand, what we've known for years and years and years, so we can, show you what's going on. So let me share my screen here.
Yeah, I think we should point out that this is epidemiology from years ago. It's not from, just a recent source within even the last few months or years. Everybody seems to be an expert epidemiologist now, but we're going to take it back a notch and talk a little about what real epidemiology is, right, Mike?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is William Farr. He was alive in the 1800s, and they made a law from his information as an epidemiologist. And so he said that the death rate is the only thing that is fact. Beyond the death rate, everything else is an inference, meaning that we don't know, when they talk about infection rates and how many cases and all this other stuff, we're not sure exactly, because we have to infer a lot of that stuff because we don't know everybody. We haven't tested everybody who's possibly had this, and we can't test everybody. But the one thing that we know is for sure fact is the death rate. So we're going to keep that in mind, because that's what we're going to use as our standard of what's going on. So this is Farr's law. And basically what he showed on this graph is that basically all epidemics basically have this kind of bell-shaped curve where you have your infections, and there's a lag time, and obviously those infections turn into deaths. And that's what we're seeing with this Farr's law. But I want you guys to look at this shape of this curve, because that's going to be something that we're going to also talk about as we get into more of the information. Now, there was another great book that was done by another epidemiologist named Hope Simpson. And this book is called The Transmission of Epidemic Influenza. And the big thing about this, and obviously, if you want to read something about what's going on and you like this kind of stuff, it's a great book to read. But the big idea was, they talked about the seasonality of these flus. And you see the influenza and the coronavirus have similar seasons because they are similar flus. They are, the single-stranded RNA virus. So they have that same time where you're going to notice things happening on that. So when we take a look at that, this is his graph that he came out, and you can see in the top, according to latitude, or like where you are, in the world, the northern temperate climates have a big spike in the winter, which we all call flu season, right? Right. And then it drops down into the summer where we don't have very much going on. And then it starts to spike up as the fall comes on. And that's that climate. And there's multiple reasons for that. They talk about vitamin D, the sun, that kind of stuff. And then in the more southern climates that are more tropical, they have a less of a spike in the winter months. And then it kind of spikes later in the season. So, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. So remember that the northern climates will spike early. The southern climates will spike a little bit later in quote unquote flu season.
Yeah, according to this chart, it looks like the flu goes away in the summertime, right?
Basically, and that's kind of what we notice is that, we have a big dip in that area. So we're going to take a look at some of the graphs that are happening in different parts of the world. So here's one graph, and guess where this is at? There you go. It's that this is the graph of Sweden, and we're going to talk a little bit about Sweden versus the United States because that was the only good comparison I could come up with as far as the lockdown stuff. But you can see this graph very much follows, when we're talking about the deaths. So the cases spiked back here, and then the deaths spiked up and then just went down. Now, Sweden, obviously a northern climate, we had the big spike early, and then it went down as the summer months came through. Now we take a look at the United States. So you can see that the United States has a double hump, and I'm just taking these straight from the Worldometer because I don't know exactly. I know that there's been a lot of controversy on what's a case and how many, what's happening as far as how they're reporting these deaths. That's why we have these like spikes here because there's different reporting. But in general, you can see that it's a double hump curve. And that's very much along the lines of what Hope Simpson talked about. The northern states have a early spike and the southern states have a later spike. And this graph will show you even better what I'm talking about. So this is the COVID deaths per week per million from the CDC data. And you can see that New York, our hardest hit state, had a major spike way early in the epidemic. In things like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and all of these northern states, New Jersey, had their big spike early in the season, and then boom, they went down. Then the southern states are over here, like Arizona, Texas, Florida. All of these states had their spike later because that's just the way that, as Hope Simpson talked about, that most epidemics or the flu virus reacts. And then
it's a little hard to see on there, Mike, but would you say that the biggest spike with New York, that's like what, third week of April, and then in the southern states, that's about mid-July for like
Correct.
Florida there?
Yep, correct. Yep, that's exactly where that's at. And then the dotted line is overall the United States. So the interesting thing is, like, when you look at deaths per week per million, and you put the United States compared to what was happening in New York, we freaked out because of just one state with this New York, when really this, according to our population, look at the difference. It's kind of interesting how
that's averaging the 330 million population in the US, right? The dotted line.
Correct.
Where New York is just comparing New York's population, which is what, 7 to 10 million probably.
Right. I mean, it's still got a high population and they had a high death rate, but this is just the state of New York, or this is just the state of Rhode Island, or that might be Connecticut. I'm sorry, Connecticut. These colors are pretty close in color, but the dotted line is the U.S. in general. So I mean, the idea that everybody, like, we had all of these deaths, and this was the most deadly virus ever. Well, I think that could be definitely debatable. So
yeah,
and no deaths are good. Now this is my great state of Colorado, and you can see that we had a very, very classic, FARS curve, and we're a little bit northern, so we had that early spike, and then things start to dissipate as the summer comes on. The interesting thing is, down here we have had mask mandate for quite a while. It was mid-July that he put in our governor Paul has put in the mask mandate, but I just thought it was interesting. Here's where the mask mandate is, and these are the deaths as far as going beyond that. I don't know. Do you think that mask mandate really made a huge difference?
Is it helpful? It looks exactly like if you took June before, it's the same going up and down, right?
Yep.
And here's another interesting thing too. Colorado, you maybe could compare to South Dakota. We had our lockdown March 21st, I think ours started ish. Not as much maybe as you guys, but still the rate went extremely high for weeks after that.
Right.
Colorado,
yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and the thing is that some of these policies, and this is what we're going to talk about right now, is the actual lockdown policy, because the only way that we can truly gauge the difference is we have to look at, an apples to apples comparison in the sense of a country that didn't do a lockdown versus a country that did. And that's why I had to pick Sweden, because there were a few other countries that didn't do, they did local lockdowns, and they didn't do as many as big of a nationwide lockdown as we did here in the United States. And now I know the United States, for you guys, your lockdown wasn't as aggressive as maybe Colorado's or other states like California. But in general, the United States did a lockdown and we have mask mandates. Sweden, they did not do a lockdown. They recommended social distancing for their population. They did not send kids home even last year. They did send the high school and college kids home, but all of the elementary school kids all still went to school and are back in school right now, which I wish my kids were too, but they are not. So that's kind of an issue. So let's take a look at this. And the interesting thing, once again, this is Worldometer, and I did this made this up a few weeks ago. So that's why we have two lines here. So the first number, this first line was a couple weeks ago. This is the United States, and you can see that in this red box, this is the deaths per million for the United States. Back a few weeks ago, it was 602. Now it's 621 today. In Sweden, a few weeks ago, their deaths per million was 579, and then today is 581. Do you notice a little trend there?
Yeah.
Obviously, maybe Sweden got a little bit closer to herd immunity and is now not experiencing the huge increases in the death rates. So that's what's going on. So when we take a look at this and we compare the United States and Sweden population, we obviously know that we're about 30 times the population. The total deaths obviously is quite a bit less. So then when we average that out for deaths per million population, you can see that we are actually 40 more deaths per million than Sweden is. And this was once again, Sweden with no lockdown, kids in school, that kind of stuff. So what does that really mean? And this is what when you really look at the numbers, it's not much. I mean, and so we're talking about, look at this percentage, 0.00000044. It's like there's just not a huge amount of difference in the deaths. And we absolutely we handled this completely different, as far as what's going on. And here's the scary thing too, is that the United States is still going up, and what would have happened if we would have let this run its course like a normal flu season? Would we still be going up, or will we be like Sweden and actually that death rate slowing down, or basically stabilizing?
Because the coronavirus was in essence following the curve of a normal flu season, right?
Correct.
Like we started tracking with it.
Right. So I hate to do this, but we got to bring some logic back into the debate. If you think about it, during this whole pandemic, we had essential workers working, correct? You still had to go to the grocery store. We had healthcare workers that were working. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the data, there was no difference in the number of deaths, once again, looking at deaths in these essential worker groups. So if that was the case, I mean, I know back in April, when this was spiking down here in Colorado, we were going to Costco without masks and with the massive humanity. And these people, these grocery store workers, are sitting inside of a Costco, inside a building for 8 hours a day, exposed to thousands of people coming through. And yet they didn't have a huge spike of, you don't hear, all of these grocery store workers falling over dead. And so, and we did, I'm sure there were some deaths, I know there were some healthcare worker deaths, but nothing in, a grand, a huge scheme. And these healthcare workers were probably working directly with people who were very ill. So they were definitely exposed, and they were probably using PPE. So that was a benefit, but the grocery store workers weren't until.
Yeah. And that was back when,
for us, it was May. Like for us, we didn't have to actually, like Costco implemented a mask policy in May after everything was going down. So, I mean, and once again, we can debate the mask stuff, whether that works or not, but that's logically, what's going on. So did these lockdowns really work? And more importantly, what did they do to our country? And what was not only the economic impact, but some of the other health impacts we're going to just dive into here. So I found this really cool website, and it looks at, like, from the World Bank numbers, what happened to the gross domestic product, or the GDP of countries. And you can see that where the darker countries had the lost more GDP. So this is the United States, and up here is Sweden. So I mean, obviously,
is this of the entire world, Mike? Like even China and Australia, everybody?
correct. Yep. Yeah.
Interesting.
So the thing is, I mean, obviously the GDP was affected everywhere because it was a worldwide pandemic, as they said. So everybody got affected. But the United States, because we shut everything down, at least in certain states, we shut all restaurants down. We shut all, like any kind of community situation, whether it's barbershops, all this stuff. We definitely put a lot more into this, and this was a lot harder economically hit than other parts of the world. So as you can see here, our loss, so according to Sweden had a total economic loss of 8.3%. United States, more than double. And then when you look at also the mental health aspect of what's going on, so the mental health aspect, this is coming directly from the CDC, was 41% of adults surveyed in late June reported an adverse mental or behavioral health condition. And I know that suicides, other health things like people not getting care because they were so scared to go into their doctor, those kind of things, we had a much greater cause of death through those things. So my big question, from this is, was this lockdown worth it? And even more, we're talking about a second wave. Why would we have a second wave if we would have handled this like a normal flu season? I don't know. I mean, that's a big question. I mean, this was a novel coronavirus, but it wasn't anything that was this super bug that was going to come through and wipe out the population. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you guys was here's what's going on and why we were doing what we were doing, and does it make sense?
Yeah, and you can even see like the natural progression of that chart from the book of saying, even with what we've done, it's progressed on its own. And in our prior video, we pulled in a couple different doctors who talked about are 80% of the people innately immune to this virus.
Mm-hmm.
And so by locking down, what I'm seeing in our community right now is people aren't having the respiratory issues. It's just showing up as the flu symptoms, headache, fever, feel like crap, right? But not everybody gets it. Husband might get it, wife does not.
Right.
Symptoms, I mean, when I say get it, symptom-wise.
Right.
So it's in my just small clinic, it's showing up as being, all right, the immune system can kick this bug in the butt.
Absolutely. And I guess the one frustrating thing is we're counting cases. Now, when they say cases, they've redefined what that means. Normally cases mean that this is somebody who has to be hospitalized or has significant symptomology that is being recorded as a case. Now they're just recording positive tests. Now you see that, in that United States, we've had a little spike recently in some of the states. Well, here's the problem with that is because of the way that we're testing, we're getting what's called a false tail, meaning that they're testing so many people and the way that they're reporting it, they're actually like, if somebody tests positive or test negative and does another test and has test positive, and then they want to see down the road whether they still have the active virus and they test again and they test positive, they're either double counting people, or the PCR test, the way that they're actually doing this PCR test is getting a lot more false positives, and we're doing more of those PCR tests, and that's what's causing this false tail of cases. Once again, cases, not deaths, which are, remember in the beginning, are what we really need to be looking at.
Right, because that's initially what we were spooked about, is it's a deadly virus, deaths, right? We circle back to deaths. And I think another important thing to mention is cases doesn't mean are tested positive, which is a case now, doesn't mean they were even symptomatic. I would say 50% of people I work on may have tested positive, but did they have symptoms? 50% I would say do not even have a symptom.
Right, but they're considered a case.
Correct.
Even though they're not symptomatic. So that's what's going on currently. And I just really, with us still doing some of this stuff, I'm not really sure that the science backs it up. There really isn't any really good science, and logic definitely doesn't back it up. So that's what's going on.
What I love. That's what I love about you, Mike, is you always bring logic and data back into it, because it's all we really can do is data, is not jump on a political platform or even a health philosophy, right? Medicine versus chiropractic, allopathic versus naturopathic, right? All these different philosophies, but we go back to the data. what does it say? Was it said for, you know, with FAR, it's 100 and some years that this is shown that this spike and bell curve occurs.
Yep. And that's exactly what's happened with this as well. So, you know,
All
folks,
right.
you're going to be all right.
Great. I'm excited. We got this.
Yeah, awesome.
Hey, Mike, always appreciate your time.
No
Thanks for
problem.
checking in. And for those of you out there, stay tuned. We got more great information coming as we head into the fall to the flu season. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Scott.